And we should be live right now. I hope everybody hears me, sees me, and also our great guest today, Gerta. So welcome everybody. I'm just gonna give a couple of seconds for the tool to have you in. And yeah, for the people who don't know me, I'm Vilana and I'm the Community Program Manager of WeAreDevelopers and the host of WeAreDevelopers live series every week, coming for you from my living room or for my bedroom to entertain you with some developers knowledge. Today we're going to talk about autonomous and automated testing, and we have Gerta here with us. Before we start, as always, we have a couple of house rules. Please feel free to say hello in the chat section on the right side of the tool. There you can actually tell us where you're from, what do you do, and just to get to know each other and to feel more connected through this online setting. Another thing that we really encourage you is to ask questions. So Gertrude will be taking the questions at the end of the presentations, but throughout the whole presentation, you can submit your questions. Right next to the chat section, there is a question mark, and when you click on it, then they're gonna go directly into the Q&A mode or to that section. So then it's easier for us at the end to select the questions among all the comments. I'm seeing already that you are typing and you're saying hi from Hamburg, from Croatia, from Vienna. So very nice to see already an international crowd. And yeah, for the ones who don't know, we're developers. Happy to meet you today. We are a platform for developers that provides jobs opportunities. So if you are a developer right now looking for opportunities, or if your team actually needs more support, you can also go and post your job on our platform. So make sure you check wearedevelopers.com for this. And without losing more time for today's webinar, I want to introduce you to Gerta. She's a product manager for AI and machine learning at Tricentis. And with this being said, we're going to switch to her screen. I'm going to mute myself and turn off my camera so you can have your full focus on her. And she can tell you a lot about software testing. So enjoy.
Thank you, Viljana. Thanks for the kind introduction. Hi everyone, so my name is Gerta, and as you heard, I'm a product engagement manager for AI and machine learning at Tricentis. Before doing that, I was a digital transformation strategist at Tricentis, and I was mainly working with a lot of our larger customers to figure out what they need in their transformation journey from a rather waterfall approach to going more towards an agile approach and really transforming the organization and their testing practices in especially. So today I want to give you a bit of an overview of the evolution and the future of software testing. So basically where most of our customers, what we see out there, where they start out and what journey they go through, and then also talk a bit about what it is where we see the software market approaching and especially the testing market and how that can really be plugged into what developers are doing to really bring development and testing a bit closer together to really get into a DevOps approach. So before I start off, when I did my last presentation around testing, I heard a couple of people afterwards giving me the feedback that they really don't understand how you can make testing such an interesting topic. So when you look at testing in itself, it really is a rather boring topic to most people. Most people don't really want to think about testing too much. But when you look at the importance of testing in organizations, it's really huge. So we took a lot of studies here, and we're going to go through some numbers in terms of reports and what they say around the adoption of testing, especially in DevOps, and when you try to create innovative software. So especially when trying to create innovative software, the number one bottleneck nowadays still is having your testing set up correctly. So it's not really around doing your planning too much. It's not too much around the code and the development that you do, because there are tons of tools out there. There's tons of support around that area. But when you have everything developed, people struggle with the testing part of it. Also, when you look really at a bigger picture of what is the main barrier for most customers out there when it comes to achieving a higher level of automation, the number one thing that they keep mentioning is really the high frequency of changes that happen to applications. So usually, as technology progresses very fast, we see a lot of changes happening. So developers really want to use a lot of different tools. They want to try something new out. So we see frequent changes in the basis that we're working with. But that's, of course, a big challenge for automating and creating automated tests, especially. Also, another big challenge that's often mentioned is around test data, how to set up your environments to really have your DevOps pipelines work with the right data in the right environments correctly. Other things that are really mentioned often are a lack of skill and experience, especially because a lot of developers really want to focus mostly around the development of new features. So when we look at organizations, when we see developers, we see people that are really interested in innovation. They are future-minded. They really want to create something new, and they don't want to sit there and maintain all those test cases. So usually, when you're a developer, you kind of tend to go more towards that I want to develop a lot and test as little as possible approach. And basically, you do all the testing that is needed just so you don't have a headache. Which is why a lot of the testing is usually given to resources that specialize more on the testing and that try to automate and work together with the development departments to really have stable and working pipelines set up. So if you also look at the IT budget that companies have there, it also shows you really what a huge problem testing is out there. So there is a $40 billion large manual testing market that is still happening in companies. So really, this is really insane if you think about it. So people want to speed up their automation, but they are kind of hindered because testing processes and the testing is not set up correctly in the organization, and it costs them a lot. Also, we looked at some research around what DevOps organizations are saying once they have basically approached a higher maturity in their DevOps journey. So whenever we talk to customers that are in a state where they are basically, you can say, complete with your DevOps transformation, although I don't like to use that word because you're never really complete with it, you're in a very advanced state. They see testing, 80% of them say that testing is a big business priority for them in their organizations. When you go to less mature organizations, you see that they don't focus so much around testing. So there's really a correlation around how well your DevOps pipelines are working and how much effort you have set up into building up a really functioning testing pipeline. I also wanted to give a bit of a regional comparison here because especially as I was really working with customers globally, I always saw that there was a bit of a difference whenever I was talking to the APAC region. And now we also have it in numbers. And you can really see that the APAC region, when it comes to automating testing, they are ahead of other regions like EMEA and Americas. Also, when you look at APAC in terms of how much they are actually focusing their different efforts around testing, they're also focusing more efforts around testing. And also when you look at the businesses in APAC region, they prioritize testing as part of the whole DevOps transformation process, which leads to better outcomes. We, as the WeAreDevelopers, is a bit of a recruiting platform as well. I also wanted to show a bit numbers around the satisfaction of testers and the income of testers across regions. That income is adjusted to the living standards in the different regions. And you can see that especially in APAC and Americas, testers are really valued a lot and actually also earn a lot. And especially in the APAC region, there is a very high response from both testers saying that they're very happy with their work, as well as managers saying that they're very happy with the work that their testers are doing. So when you look at it also from what is currently the most important things that CIOs are looking into. Currently, we're really looking into 5 major topics. The one thing is around cloud computing. And here, especially when you link it back to testing, you have to make sure that enterprises and their strategies align to a cloud native application development approach. So really, we want to minimize the risk during those migrations of tests to the cloud from on-premise software. Also, data warehousing, BI, and analytics is a very big point. So there's a big need to be able to make the right business decisions very early on with a high confidence that the data that you're using has a high data integrity, actually. When you look at machine learning, that is something that also comes up over and over again. So a lot of companies are looking into how they can actually incorporate more AI and machine learning into their processes. And especially in the testing space, there are a lot of ways how you can actually do that, which we will go through a bit later on. And another big point that often comes up is really around the digital transformation part. So we really need to achieve a place, even if the AI is set up, and if we have really cool platforms and processes set up, we still need to have a way to link all those bits and pieces together to really achieve true digital transformation. And another thing that is, of course, on the top of everyone's mind is currently around security. So what you can often observe when you look for DevOps pipelines is something like this. So a real Picasso, you can say. This is a beautiful picture. Usually you just find those pictures in rather small testing environments. So you have small teams, either a startup that is doing everything right from the start, or you have a smaller department in a large organization that is setting up beautiful DevOps pipelines. But if you take a bit of a step back and look at it, you usually kind of find a weird picture, and then you step back a bit further and further and even further, and then you suddenly realize, once you see the whole picture, you kind of figure out that the whole DevOps pipeline in your department may go smoothly, but the whole big picture is not a Picasso anymore. It's really as if a toddler would be scribbling all over a board with different colors, and it's really hard to see through the jungle and everything that's happening in your organization. What we have seen often is whenever people start with something like a DevOps transformation, or they want to incorporate more testing into their current pipelines, more automated testing, is that they usually start with those greenfield projects. What that means is these are those customer-facing touch points where most customers start their transformation in, because it's really the most visibility outside and it has a high impact. Then you also have those brownfield applications, though, where you really have those old CRM systems and billing systems and hosts and whatnot. And there it becomes really difficult once you start to get into automated testing. Because in greenfield applications, 20% of your overall budget goes into those. So you start with those and you automate those in a very nice way, but then you're still left off with the rest of your organization, which is really the one that is currently eating up the most budget. Also, when trying to link those together, you really also have to consider the different dynamics that you have in those teams. So while in those rather greenfield applications or systems of innovation, you usually have cycles of a couple of days or weeks, or sometimes even seconds and minutes, depending on your organization. When looking at those systems of record, you're usually thinking really about months. So now the question is, how can we really incorporate those? And should we do like more of an incremental change, or should we do more of an iterative change when it comes to transformation? So what I like to say here is, when you ask operations, and operations, these are usually the people that are really concerned about having a stable system in place, getting everything in a stable way where you're sure, okay, this is the system, that's where we're going to plug things in, nothing's going to break. When you ask them, they're more for an iterative transformation. When you then talk to developers, they say, oh, we're going to make everything incremental. We're going to work on this, we're going to ship this, and we're going to work on the next problem and ship the next problem. What actually happens though is if you have those two mindsets in the companies, that you end up with something like this. So you have actually developers kind of creating the things, but the bits and pieces just don't find their way. So you really have to make sure that you have also, especially in larger setups, a way where you say, okay, we combine both the iterative approach and the incremental approach, and we allow developers to create those iterations of new software. We test those, but also everything is a bit in certain structure. So we need to allow for some guidance and guidelines around how to actually create things in larger settings. So when thinking about that, we have created something that we call the ACT framework currently that really tries to deal with that problem. When you go through something like an agile transformation, what a lot of larger customers are doing is that they usually take existing frameworks out there that help you to understand what it is that you really need to do when you set up your first agile teams, how you set up more agile teams, how you kind of link them together on an enterprise level. And there are a couple of frameworks out there. Some are called like the LESS framework, the SAFE framework, the Spotify framework is another one. But what all those frameworks do is they kind of tell you that you need to think about testing, but no one really explains you how to really do it. And that's something that we saw out there over and over again. So I was working together with a couple of other colleagues of mine to really set this ACT framework up, to spin it off, and it is now an industry independent framework where we have a couple of partners working together that have tons and tons of customers in the testing space that have seen hundreds and millions of customers go through those digital transformations. And we try to really synthesize all the knowledge that we have here around testing in this framework. I can't really go into the details of this because this is just way too much, but just so you understand the high level idea is that you usually would start off with something like looking at the team level, how you set up your testing in your teams initially, what roles you would have in your teams initially, what they would need access to, start off with some service virtualization in your teams to be able to work together with some other teams in the organization before your services are available, and really spin off your organization from a team level, then think about how you can really take the knowledge that you got out of those first initial teams into the large organization. And then usually you would need more enablement and guidance. You would need an enterprise enablement team and things like that that oversee the entire process and really help you to understand how to set that up across different programs and across the entire enterprise. So here at Tricentis especially, we have synthesized the knowledge from this ACT framework into something that we call the elements of continuous testing, and that is something that we go through with a lot of our customers. So especially customers that start out with their testing transformation, we help them set up the right strategies and the right roles and the right responsibilities in their teams initially, and then we help them to scale that up. So what you really see here is that usually on the team level, we, as I said, we focus on the roles, we focus on having your first test coverage in place, having your first automation of your tests in place, and a really important point is really thinking about how you want to set up your environments, how you want to deal with all of your test data, putting that all together and having a basic strategy around testing in the teams. And then getting a couple of teams together, thinking more about how do you build resilience automation? How do you deal with test management? How do you do service virtualization to work together with a couple of teams and later on even with a larger part of the organization? And that would be a place where you would basically really promote all of your efforts. And that's something that's really, really important, actually, and that we see a lot of our customers failing, is setting up everything correctly, but then kind of struggling to promote it in the rest of the organization. So if you think about that Picasso picture that you had there, setting up everything in your small team perfectly, but then kind of lacking the capability of really having the right reports in place, having the right communication setup in place to also communicate to the rest of the organization how this could actually work. So you really set up a broader vision and a test strategy in your enterprises. Especially as I'm talking so much now about service virtualization as well, this is a topic that's really interesting, especially when it comes to shift left testing. So we're always hearing like testing should be shifted more to the left. We should test as early as possible. And those tests that we create very early on should be as close as possible to what we want to have then running in production. And when you take this kind of more of a developer's perspective, what you see out there is usually our customers and a lot of companies out there still have a lot of those monolithic large applications. And back then, I would say now, it was rather easy to do your unit testing of those applications, and then you had a separate department being more responsible for those end-to-end tests, using also service virtualization if certain parts were not available. And now, as we move more into microservices architecture and those monoliths are split up, everything gets into their own clusters, and you have multiple microservices communicating with other microservices. The whole architecture is very dynamic. You have a lot of links of communication between those services. So we see two major, or actually three major problems here when it comes around testing. The first problem really would be around how do you make sure that your tests of those services always return the right result according to that service that you're trying to test. So as there are so many links, another service down the road in the chain might be affected and leading to your tests to fail. And it's really technically challenging to figure out what that would be. Or you want to do something like performance testing, for example, and you want to nail down what is the bottleneck in your system, what service is the bottleneck, what link is the bottleneck. And another big problem is really around the topic that not all services inside a cluster are really reachable from outside the cluster, and a lot of testing tools that you would plug into such clusters can't really communicate with it. So how do you set up your test environments in a way that they mimic production as close as possible? And if you can, I would love to hear in the comments if that's something that you're struggling with in general. So splitting up applications into microservices and really trying to overcome those testing challenges, especially as at Tricentis, we recently had an innovation week. Basically, you can say we had 3 days of innovation where we could come up with a couple of new concepts how to solve problems out there, and especially in my team, we were working on solving this problem here. And of course, I would love to have some vitamin B as we're still in the selection process and really hear if that's a real problem. So really what we try to do here is to bring developers and testers closer together. And that we want to achieve from all perspectives. So really give the developers the opportunity to focus on creating innovation and having a way where they can test smoothly and also outsource some of the testing to those testers in their teams who maybe don't have all of the technical knowledge or all of the understanding around the application, but they should still be able to test it as good as possible. Also, when looking at how open source plays together with standard larger testing solutions out there, We can see across our customer base that open source is, of course, a huge thing. So really try to go for an approach where you say, okay, how can we actually find a way where we combine all those open source tools together with maybe more commercial tools that are looking at those end-to-end testing scenarios and those large organizational problems together with the more developer-focused tools, and have a way that they can play together nicely. So I want to give now a very brief overview of how the software testing process in general looks like and what we're currently focusing on to really make sure that we improve here. So usually you start off in software testing with selecting the right test cases and designing the right test cases. So afterwards, you also want to automate and run them, and at the end of the day, you want to analyze if the results were good or not. So looking at that first part, first of all, you select the right test cases. If you don't have them yet, you still need to design them somehow. So the number one challenge that we see out there is around selecting the right test cases is really to that a lot of testers are really using a lot of intuition when doing that. So they don't apply really good design principles and a way where you really have a step-by-step understanding of how you came to your test cases, but it's more all kind of intuition. You kind of know the application. Often a lot of business testers, business users are involved, and then it becomes a big mess. And what we're trying to do here, and really how to overcome this, is to use some augmented intelligence tools, which is also something that we're also focusing, of course, at Tricentis, in terms of having tools in place that really help you with making the right decisions and finding the right test cases to test. And also, what you want to do is you want to analyze the impact of the changes, and that is something that you can very nicely really do with artificial intelligence. So whenever there is a change in your application, you really want to understand what was actually the impact that the change had on the entire application, and do I really need to rerun all those tests? What tests do I need to rerun? And when looking at that, there's a very good example here, especially when it comes to, for example, testing of SAP or packaged app applications. That's something where you can observe this to the extreme. So the business users or the key users are really heavily involved in the testing phase, and they go 100% after their intuition. And what we see often happen afterwards is that those tests don't cover everything that is needed. And what happens is that you get into something like a hypercare phase afterwards, meaning you get all those testers and developers and business users, all of them together and trying to fix the problem. And this usually goes over months and months, and you get everyone occupied for a very long time, which is something that you really want to avoid. And here we are actually working at Tricentis. We're working with an AI-based approach. If you want to have more insight into that, I currently don't have the time to go into the depths. That's really interesting. You can look that up. It's our Live Compare product. And so basically the main idea behind this is that usually you have a certain number of use cases that change, and just a smaller size of your application is really impacted by the change. And we have developed an approach which is linked to AI, where you can really reduce that scope drastically to just change to just test the parts of the application that have the highest impact and are most at risk. So you really can speed up your testing. The second big challenge that we see the big challenge that we see out there when it comes to automating and running your tests is around a lot of technical scripting out there. And when I say technical scripting, the approach that you see and what we have tried to overcome here in the past is to get those scripts out of the way, so you can give the task of test automation also to less technical audiences in your company. And when it comes to how that works, we until now really looked at the UI level. We extracted a model out of that showed you how that application was built in general, and out of that you could extract your business information and create those test cases. The problem is, to create those models, you still had to have a lot of technical information, because really when you look at it, there is a lot of technical information that you have to understand to really be able to write stable test cases. So you need to understand the structure of your application to figure out what is a stable identifier that I can use for my tests. Am I using an auto-generated ID or not? So each type of application that you tried to test had their own technical details behind. So all those people that really should be more the testers still had to be concerned about that. And that is something that really, with an AI approach, we wanted to get rid of. And this is one of our newest products, which I'm also the product manager of, which is called NEO. NEO stands for Neural Optical Automation. And what we try to do here is to really get the code totally out of the equation. So we would only now work with an AI-driven approach, where you take very simple statements that you can basically express in natural language, and you can run those statements on any machine. So to get a bit more into details, what does this mean? So until now, you had to deal with those code snippets, and they were rather confusing. So what we wanted to do is to say, okay, this snippet is just a tutorials dropdown. So how can I tell this application to just select CSS from the tutorials dropdown, and it works? So what we did is we created two neural networks. One is really scanning your application for the different controls it sees there, and the other one is scanning your application for the different labels it sees there. And then you combine those two information. So here you would take a simple statement like this: select 5 from number of seats, and then you would apply to the application that you see on the right. So you would look for a label that is called number of seats, and you would steer the associated control. What we're trying to do here, and how this is really different to everything else that we've seen so far when it comes to AI-based UI automation or UI automation in general, is the main problems that we saw out there with UI automation. The number one problem was really around speed. And that is something that's very important, especially in all the DevOps environments, all the more agile, fast-paced environments. We want to have a way where we can really write the automation up front before we even have the UI available, like we can with other types of testing. The other big thing that we wanted to tackle is around stability of your test cases. To really offer you a way where, when you write your code for your test once, it runs also in the future after upgrades, after changes of your application. Because we want to give the developers the freedom to really keep changing the technology, keep advancing, keep modernizing things. And then at the end of the day, the old test cases would still run stably, because the way they interact with the application is just the same way that humans would interact with the application. And the third big benefit that this brings is really that you take the technical user out of the equation. So really we want to offer a way where you can put anyone to automate. So you really don't need to understand any technical details anymore. So for example, if you're automating a React application, before you had to kind of understand what is that shadow DOM kind of thing. If you're automating Angular, you had to understand all those different types of HTML elements. And then that's just the web. Then you can go also into other levels like API. There you have gRPC and REST, and they work differently. So really we want to get the tester to a state where they don't have to care about that anymore at all. So they would just be able to describe things like we would describe as humans, and interact with applications as we would as humans. So especially in the DevOps environment, when it comes around speed, as I said, everyone wants to release faster. And how that usually looks like is that you start off with something like a story card. And then you go through your build, test, deployment pipelines. And where does now UI automation really fit into the sprint? If you think about it, there was a concept like BDD, which is often used by more agile and modern enterprises, where you could specify upfront how your tests should look like on the UI. So you could use tools like Cucumber and so on. And then the problem with those was that although you can define your UI tests upfront, you still have to wait for the UI to actually be there to create your test automation. And that is a very different approach to what we see happening with other types of test automation, like unit tests and API tests. For unit tests, you don't really need much. You don't even need the code to be there to write your unit tests. For API tests, also, it's enough if you just have an API definition file and you can write your API tests. But when it comes to UI test automation, what we saw is that those scripts for creating the automation kind of got delayed for later and later in the cycle because no one had time for it. And then eventually they got into another sprint and never happened. That is something that we really try to overcome here by using that AI-based visual testing approach. And just to show you how that looks like, so basically the idea is, and that is just an idea, so that is not like a finished product, it's just the idea behind it. You can start off with something as simple as a PDF mockup. And after starting with a PDF mockup, you can open something like a web assistant. It can also be any other tool. So we are offering also VS Code integrations for the open source community. We're also plugging this engine, which is really just an engine, into other test automation frameworks and tools out there. But the idea behind it is the same. So basically, for example, if you plug it into a web assistant, via simple plug and play, now you can create your test cases out of that mockup that you have there. So you don't need anything more than that. Actually, you don't even need that mockup. As long as you can describe what it is that you want to do, those statements like select 4 from the number of seats input already run. This is already your automation. So you can now go further and say, okay, I want to give this a trial run. And if you give this a trial run now, it of course just runs against the PDF file because there's nothing more there. But it really shows you very nicely how, compared to all other approaches that have been out there so far, this does not need any technical identifiers at all. It really just takes visual clues as an input and performs the automation on those visual clues. Then you can go further and say, okay, now the real application is finally done. We have this old .NET application. We run our tests there, and the same test case that we created on that mockup also runs on the finished application, which is really cool. So when you look at this from that's like the major use case that we see in the DevOps world. But there's another use case which is actually even larger and bigger, which all of our customers are currently struggling with, which is around your standard regression set. So you have written your automation once for testing, and you want to make sure that it doesn't break anymore in the future because you really don't want to touch it. What happens though is that you have an upgrade. So you have a technology change, as I already explained, and although your UI still looks very similar, your UI tests keep breaking. And when I say very similar, I really mean that the UI does not change so much. Just as an example, this is how the ANZ Banking's website looked like 20 years ago. So this is a screenshot from the year 2000. And when you wanted to log in, you basically had to select internet banking from the control on the top right and hit the login button. What do you do now? You select internet banking from the control on the top right and you hit the login button. Nothing changed very much here. Also, when you look at the search field, it's basically exactly the same. And that's something that you can observe across the line for many applications. The flow doesn't change so much. When you take another example where this was the exact opposite, is, for example, Windows 8, where you said, okay, we're suddenly doing everything 100% different, and we're removing the start button. The first thing that came with Windows 8.1 was the start button, because while you can make drastic changes to your UI, you cannot expect your users to change just as quickly. So now the question is, why is everyone complaining? So if the UI does not change so much. So what we observed is, while we really see those simple elements, like this is a status dropdown, what you see on the code level is something very different. And we wanted to have a way where you don't need to care about that anymore. So you can move on with your development cycles, and you can give your tests to your testers, and they don't need to care about that code level anymore. So now really we wanted to give the machine a way to be just as adaptable as humans, as actually manual testers have been in the past, because they also did not care too much around if you changed all of your frameworks in the background or not. And just to show you again the concept of how this works, so we said we had the test that we've written. It's just those simple statements. It runs on a finished application. Now we do a more modern application of the same thing. So it's the same application, we just have it on the web now. So all we are doing here is basically refocusing on the web. We run the same test case, and it still runs just the same. And it goes even further. It can also run behind more complex organizational structures. So, for example, a lot of our customers are struggling with having everything, because of security regulations, behind a Citrix interface. And then it all gets messed up because you don't have access to those technical identifiers anymore. And it becomes really hard to steer those interfaces and to perform your automation, which is something that with that AI-based approach, you're not struggling at all anymore with, because you're still just steering the interface as you would as a human. Thinking about this from what is kind of the, you can say, who would benefit most of that approach. So it's both the low-tech group as well as the high-tech group. So from a low-tech perspective, you really can give this out to business users, manual testers, exploratory testers, user acceptance testers, and so on. And they can just simply very easily write the automation and give it over to the more high-tech audience, who now has all those capabilities and all the flexibility that you had from very simple script-based approaches. So it's just a script. You can work with it throughout your CI/CD pipelines. You can put it into version control and so on. And you get all that input from those business users at the same time. But compared to what script-based approaches were struggling with so far, which was reliability, those tests now are rock solid. As you can see, they run on those interfaces from 20 years ago. They also run now. We try to basically make here an assumption that they will also run in the future. And when you look at it from a high-tech audience, you can even go a step further and say, okay, we just use a VS Code integration and write all of our tests in there with a bit more complex constructs around it. And as I said, and just so you get a bit of an understanding how this works, is on the top you see an application, and that's actually just a video of an application that we got from YouTube. I think it's ServiceNow. And on the bottom you see what the AI engine Neo annotates. So basically it figures out where are all those controls, what is the center of those controls, with what probability can I say that it is a certain control or not. And then at the same time, this is the object detection algorithm. At the same time, there is an OCR algorithm, which really is the, I would say, more difficult component here, because there are a couple of OCRs out there from those very large cloud providers like Google and Amazon, and they all work, but the problem with them is that they are very slow. So usually the OCR really takes like around a second to rescan the screen, and that's something that was not acceptable for us. We really needed something that was faster than you could really blink with the human eye. And that's why we created our own OCR, which is really focused on the space of test automation. And at the end, to sum it up, after we talked now really about how this AI-based approach can help us with automating and running test cases, the next thing that we're looking into, especially from an AI perspective, is now how can we actually analyze those test cases. So when it comes to analyzing test cases, there are a lot of problems like test data, your test environments, and so on. And when you look at those things, especially when tests fail, when you have false positives. So basically, actually, there was not an error in your application, but you still got an error. That's 72% of most cases that we see out there usually. So people really struggle with having their test environments and test data in place, but also they have a lot of automation issues. So we have a lot of solutions to try to overcome that. But especially when it comes now to finding the real errors, we're working with a lot of new AI approaches where you also do things like analyzing the build reports out of GitHub and so on to really find errors and defaults early on before they even reach any testing systems. So I really want to conclude with that statement, which I really like to conclude with a couple of times. It's the number one testing tool out there is still not the computer, it's the human brain. Why I say that is because you really hear a lot around how we're going to go into this autonomous testing, which is really a buzzword currently, that really tries to find an analogy between self-driving cars and testing, and how you can now get more into that direction of really having all your tests run autonomously. There are a lot of approaches in terms of AI, and I could go into many details here, where you can really help augment the experience of the tester in terms of making their life easier, but really having everything in place still takes a lot of human effort. It also takes a lot of process effort. So you really have to think about the different roles and responsibilities and processes and how you set things up across the organization to make sure that everything really runs smoothly. So we're really still far away from something where you say autonomous testing, it's just working out of the box. There are a lot of solutions that really help you to guide your way to have more smooth DevOps pipelines. So that's it from my side. Viliana? I think it's time to basically take some questions now. As I was sharing my screen, I wasn't really able to see them.
Yeah. You should see me now.
I see them now, yes.
Can you hear me or see me?
Yes, I can see you.
And can you hear me?
Yes, I can also hear you.
Okay. Okay, perfect. Awesome. So then, yeah, thank you for the presentation. We will be taking now some Q&A. So yeah, we'll start pretty much from the first one from Sebastian, and I'll put on the big screen so everybody can actually see it. So can you give us a link to more infos on the AI approach on selecting text cases? This is his question. I guess if you cannot, like, you can go ahead and see if you have it right now.
I don't have a link to it, but I could find some material and send it over. If you're really interested, you can just write me on LinkedIn or something. All right.
As well, maybe from our side, if you can send us the link and then we can post it later together with the video on YouTube.
Yeah, sure. Sounds good. So a couple of other questions.
The next question is from Sander.
So you want to reinvent BDD and you use synthetic grids for guide elements like Rex doesn't natively. How does your AI cope with multiple language labels? So we don't really want to reinvent BDD here at all. Actually, the solution should basically plug into BDD solutions. So we're actually working together with one of the open source BDD solutions out there to plug in a neo capability to the BDD approach. So you will still be able to define upfront what you're doing, but compared to everything else that's been out there, you don't really have that scripting approach, right? So you're really just writing your your instructions in very simple, understandable language. And I'm not sure what you mean with multiple language labels, but if you mean like if you have an application that can switch between different languages, that's something that we've also incorporated into the overall design of our AI engine, where you're really able to specify different languages for the labels, and it can also work with them automatically, so you wouldn't have to rewrite the test just to rewrite the language.
Thank you. The next question is again from Sebastian.
So the UI changes frequently. How does the AI approach react on that? So very good question. So that's the idea behind it. The UI really changes, but the changes, as long as they are just process-related changes, as long as they are non-process related changes, so really just the look and feel of the UI changes, those new test scripts would still run on your user interface, because it does not care about how the user interface looks like. Does not care about the technology it's written in. It does not care about on which type of machine you run it on, if it's running on a Mac or if it's running on Windows. It really doesn't care about any of that. It just interacts with it like a human. So if there's an instruction that you can give to a human, like select something from a drop-down, and you can give that also to our Neo engine, it would perform exactly the same thing. Hope that answers it.
Hope that's clear. He has actually has another question, and which is relevant for everybody as well. Do you have interfaces to use approach for automating page objects?
So we are basically the Neo engine is just developed as an UI engine, and we're currently figuring out where we want to plug it into what other types of applications we want to plug it in. So of course we're plugging it in the Tricentis test suite. So we have our Tosca application where it's already part of. We have the Q-test application that's for test management, where you can get a lot of applications together and get also reporting around that. There, Neo will also be part of it. In terms of BDD, we're also plugging it into our newest acquisition, which is called SpecFlow. But for everything else, so we're open to having discussions around other tools to plug it into. But yeah, that's something that might happen down the road.
Cool. Then we have another question from Zdenko. Can you test mobile applications?
Yeah, so we're currently working also with our mobile team. So we have a mobile testing team to finalize an integration also for mobile applications, yes.
Short and clear. Then we go to Andre. Where can we get access to Neo? Is it available as a product?
Yeah, so I'm afraid I'm creating too much noise here again. It's all gonna come back to me currently. So we're still developing Neo. If you're really interested in it, you can contact me. We're currently in the team still in the phase where we're releasing now next week a first preview version of it for our current customers. For everyone else, that will take a bit longer. But there is a beta program also running. So if you're really interested in using it and trying it out, you can contact me and we can see if we can set up something in a beta arrangement.
Cool. Next, we have a bit longer question from Peter. Could you please explain more about the machine learning model? Where does it run? Do I have as a user any training to do? What is it under the hood? TF segment.
So the machine learning model is running on Azure DevOps Cloud. Both models are there. We have used very different types of training data. So in terms of training data, we have by now fed in more than 10 million controls. and it is basically growing. So it's not that we feed in the customer data that we get, but there are different types of resources, or if a customer allows us to use their applications data, we use that for training and for improving the models.
Good. And I think this is our last question. Congratulations for the presentation. Is the presentation going to be available to download? From our side, the recording is going to be there on our YouTube channel after Gerta checks it. And yeah, maybe she can give you access to the slides.
I can definitely give you access to the slides, sure.
Awesome. And there are two more questions just showed up, so we can answer them as well. How can people get in touch with you?
So I would say the easiest thing is to contact me on LinkedIn, but please write a message that for the purpose of the contact request, and I should respond.
Exactly. So you can write to her that you watch her webinar and then you have some questions, so you don't spam her. And I think then this is the last one. Again, going back to the topic from Simona, what are some challenges of AI test automation tools? Is this really the way of our future in testing?
So yeah, in terms of AI test automation, there are tons of challenges when you look at how you really design AI models, especially having all of that training data that you have to use until you have it in a state where it's really working. So there's so many areas of application, especially looking from the whole cycle in testing, how you really figure out what test data to work with and how to feed them into your systems. There's so many places where you can work with AI, but really you need to be able to feed information into the systems that they learn. So they're basically like a toddler, you can say. You give them information, and as they progress, they learn. This is still the biggest challenge, I would say. It's definitely the future in testing, so it's definitely the way where it's going, where we're having more and more places where we figure out how we can actually replace mundane tasks that are kind of repetitive, where we can find a way where we can take the burden away from testers and make it easier for them.
Thank you very much. And I think, yeah, that's pretty much it from the questions. Or is there one more? We had one more. Okay, this is the last questions we can take because our recording and presentation is pretty much 1 hour. So let's take this last one. Any ideas of integrating the mocker part directly to a specific dev environment and generating partly the unit tests?
That is a very good question. So the mocker part is not really part of the AI approach that we were talking about now. It's more like the idea that spin up in our gig at Resentis, our great ideas gathering. But I looked into a couple of approaches here, and actually really you can see that there are different ways, for example, especially when it comes to having your cloud applications and you want to test your cloud applications. How do you do that also locally in your local environment before getting them into a test environment? And so there are a couple of tools out there. One that comes to mind is, for example, Local Stack, where you can kind of mock a whole AWS environment and have everything run there. That's there are a couple of tools.
Awesome. Well, I think with this we can close the conversation. There are a lot of thank you comments in our chat section. So from our side as well, thank you, Gerta, for being part of this webinar today. You've been at a couple of our events already, so it's always nice to have you. And I hope soon we'll have you again, either online or in a physical event.